Heard you. All right. Yeah, I know. I'm presenting to everybody. Let's see. Every time we do this. Okay. Technically speaking, this is part of the axial skeleton. It is actually a more significant bone when we talk about muscles. It's called the hyoid bone. It's not. It's in the neck, and it's the only bone that doesn't connect to another bone. Really, it's a bone because it's here, and even on this skeleton, they have wired together. It's not attached to anything. It forms within the muscles that allow you to swallow and speak. So it's really more significant with regard to muscle anatomy than anything else. So it's the only one that doesn't attach to any of the others. Helps, attach to the tongue, swallowing, and speaking, as I said. So it's an oddball bone. Very important forensically. When someone's strangled or choked, they look for that. Typically, that bone cracks. So so a lot of the material I present to you, as you will see, has implications like that. And when I do the lecture part, I talk a lot about fractures and the fractures that might indicate abuse or neglect or those types of things. But here it is. You can feel it's right above your Adam's apple. It's hard to feel. Okay, and the orbits themselves, those are the 7 bones. You should know those. Frontal, sphenoid, zygomatic, maxillopalatine, lacrimal, ethmoid. Not to worry about the nasal cavity or the cartilages, the sinuses. That's more respiratory to me, and that's everything there. Now, making that wonderful noise. Okay. The next major part, there's not a lot for me to say about ribs. So really, it's really all we're dealing with. The rest of the anatomy here is of the axial skeleton is certainly the spinal column. And so what you can see is these are by definition irregular bones because of their shape. They're referred to as vertebrae. It's the numbering that can be a little confusing. There's really more than 26, but a number of them are fused together. So when they're fused, we consider them as one. So you have 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, corresponding to each rib that you have, because all of the ribs attach to the thoracic vertebrae. That's what makes them thoracic. And 5 lumbar. And then lastly, the 2 bone that are really fusions of bones we consider as one. The sacrum, quite large, usually 4 or 5 bones that creates sort of where the hip assembly attaches. So it's a very important, we call them articulations, where these are the parts where your axial and appendicular skeleton meet. And for stability, the sacrum is a big player in that. And the coccyx or tailbone, as many of us refer to it, is usually 2, 3, 4 bones, varies, that are at the terminus. And really, it's really the vestigial, if you can think of an animal, like a dog's tail, effectively that's the vestigial part. If we were to have a tail that never developed, that's kind of what a coccyx is. And what happens with the vertebral column over time, you have to think of it as development. We have what are called curvatures. If you think of a baby when they're born, we call it the fetal position for a reason. They're all bent over like this. Their heads bound down, their hips are up. For the most part, everything is C-shaped. The back is convex. The anterior portion, going forwards, is concave. What are the 2 major events of development when you have a baby as it begins to grow? By age 3 to 6 months, their head goes upward. Okay, by roughly age 12, anywhere between 12, 15, 18 months, they start to walk. So those are accompanied because of changes in body position with changes in the curvature of the spine. So this is what it looks like straight. If you're just looking at it from front, it looks very straight. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, sacrum, coccyx. But if you look at it from the side, you have the original curvature, okay? The original curvature. So now we're looking at it is this way. This is the sacrum and the thoracic area are curved the original way. They're called primary curvatures because they're convex looking from the side at the back and concave in the front. What happens is a baby begins to develop control over their head roughly by 6 months. Those vertebrae over time develop a curvature the other way, where it's convex anteriorly, concave posteriorly. So that's a secondary curvature, and the same is true in the lumbar area. As a baby, they start by crawling, then they kind of move around, they begin to hold on to objects, eventually they stand, and eventually they walk. Those are just little highlights of development if you're a parent. We all look for those as parents, or if you have children in your family, siblings, whatever. The relationship, those are those. Parents go crazy. Oh, little so-and-so's walking. So, again, there's a lot of ligaments that hold them. I'm not going to go into those. I really don't think that's part of, it's part of anatomy, but you can go crazy with all. They are bound. What this just demonstrates is how tightly they are bound. And effectively, what happens when you sandwich these together, I'm down some bigger one. You'll be able to, as part of the course, to be able to distinguish between which region you with. So, look at these. So here we have them articulated. So it's just a plastic bottle or a piece thereof. What you can see is they're normally separated by what are called intervertebral discs. This is superior, this is inferior. And when they're situated like that properly, try to get to it kind of close together, let's say. Like so. Yeah. So as long as the disc is in there, like so, okay, it creates a natural opening on either side. You can see nerves, a nerve protruding here, or indeed a nerve protruding here. Those side-to-side openings are called intervertebral foramen. So if your nerve is coming out of the spine, will go out smoothly. If the disc is not there, it kind of squishes like this. So when you hear about a slip disc, it compresses that opening from here down to like that. And so it impinges the nerve. For somebody like me who had a disc that bulge, and happens to most of us as we get older, you end up with some degree of sciatica back pain. To that end, when class is done today at 5 o'clock, I have a chiropractor as I do every 2 weeks, just to keep my back moving around. So that's part of the anatomy. So if you look at the bone itself, and this is a pretty good example. This, because it's so large, and the way you tell, it's like this. So this way you do is hold it this way by this on the bottom, and look at it sideways. It's all about what's called the spinous process, where it's like where it's sort of like this little hatchet shape, it's sort of a shelf, short, pointing straight back. It's almost always going to be one bone. When you have one that's a little bit different, you hold it this way. This is plastic, this is real, and it points downward, then typically that is thoracic. And again, just by the spinous process. And it's a little bit easier to see the very small ones, the cervical vertebrae. One, because they're so small, and the opening here is disproportionately large. And two, They have a very small spinous process, and usually it's separate. So you have lumbar, thoracic, cervical, vertebral. The other thing that's interesting about the cervical vertebrae, only one here, and then because these are so much older, okay, they all have these little openings on the side. That's not something when they put in there, so they wire together. Those naturally occur. This is called the transverse process. So the little opening is called the transverse foramen. And what happens is when they stack up one on top of the other, they create a passageway. Again, bony passageways have important things in them. So the bony passageway in your spine, as you can see here, if we look at these openings, this is called the vertebral foramen. But they have spinal cord goes through this. But that little one on the side that I was showing you before, when they stack up, what goes through there is a blood pressure, a blood vessel rather called the vertebral artery. It's part of the circulation to your brain. The main circulation to your body. Right behind it is another set of arteries called vertebrals. And there, it's like when I say a backup circulation, it's something that allows, if there was damage, you wouldn't lose blood supply to your brain and effectively die. You can see them maybe a little bit here. Carotids in red are quite large here. Vertebrals are behind it here. So you can see they run fairly closely to one another, but so there's actually 4 vessels that can supply your brain, and one was blocked. That can be part of it. So there's a lot of little interesting things that we see. So yeah, again, I always think it's easiest to show you with these. The larger ones are just easier to look at. You get to see the way, and these aren't even exact pictures. Imagine the disc really helps to create that passageway out of opening, and then form the passageway, spine will go through. And they're just showing you all the, so the intervertebral discs are there. And it shows the disc is interesting, and even though the ones we have here are probably not natural, but probably artificially made, they have they're very thick and fibrous on the outside, rounded, called the annulus fibrosus, but soft in the middle, which is called the nucleus pulposus, gelatinous. And so this is the remnant of something that all vertebrates have called the notochord. It's one of the things that make us vertebrates. We have a notochord. What's left of it became this sort of a pulpy center, but the part that gives it strength is the fiber, is round and fibrous, and that's what annulus fibrosus means. So it's like, I think what we might have if you have trouble with your feet and bought a pair of cushioned inserts, kind of like that. You have something soft and squishy in the inside, so if your feet were sore, you could put that on. And here's what it looks like. Fibrous on the outside. Now, what happens when a disc bulges or is pinched or whatever, slips, whatever word you want to use, they're all the same. It's just a matter of degree. That fibrous part develops a weakness, and look what it does. The pulpy part herniates, pushes through, and squeezes the nerve, either by causing the vertebrae to collapse or pushing them in some way together. Here's the spinal cord on the inside. And depending on how it does it, it could be painful, it could be numbness, it could be burning, it could be needles and pins, all of those things. When mine bulged 10 years ago, it would be 10 years this summer, I never regained sensation in front of I can still use my right leg just fine. Strength isn't, it's all sensations. Like I get on my hands and knees. I don't feel anything here. It's still fairly numb. But, kicking a ball, walking, whatever, not a problem. So it's just sensory rather than motorless, just where it strikes. But did it ever hurt? Oh. And so what you have here On the top of and on the bottom of each of these vertebrae are these little facets that allow them to move. And what's interesting is there's a lot of movement that's created. Now, here is an image of a slip disc and the damage it's creating in an MRI. And now, what we do see a lot of over time, some people are born with these, most of the time they develop over time, are abnormal curvatures. The one that we see most commonly, I have to a certain extent, mine happened over years, is scoliosis, where it's like a twist in your spine. So if you go to have a physical, the doctor will have you look behind you and have you bend this. What that does is it causes the spinous processes to protrude. They run your finger. If the finger is kind of like S-shaped, scoliosis. I have this one over years, working for my dad over time. I always carry everything over my shoulders. So I used to carry 50 to 100 pound bales of belt over my shoulders. That was my family's business. It's a habit I never shook. So every time I carry something, I carry it this way. My wife carries it with two hands in front of her. I just don't do it. She goes, "You have scoliosis?" I said, "I know." So hunchback is sort of a misnomer today. We see it today a lot because of osteoporosis. Folks get elderly, the bones weaken, and the spinal bones, the vertebrae collapse, and their head, heavy, goes forward. And it looks like they have a hunchback. Historically, that's not a hunchback. I mean, someone's pregnant, very often they'll have what we call a sway back or lordosis. You'll see it. Scoliosis. See, this is hunchback. She wasn't born with this. This developed because of osteoporosis. She wasn't born with this. It's developed because of pregnancy. So we used to see more spinal defects. Now there's a lot better idea of prenatal vitamins and prenatal care that have helped over time. We're much more alert to those things. We used to have a lot of spinal problems, unfused spinal cords. They found it associated with folic acid deficiencies. So now, most time when someone is going to have a baby, they're on a lot of prenatal vitamins. Everything has changed with regard to the amount of weight gain, all that stuff. There's been a lot of changes that are there. This is what a vertebrae looks like generically, somewhat. The body, which I showed you before, and then we'll show you what the arch looks like. That's where the spinal cord goes through, creating this opening, and then the side openings I showed you. So this is a general view. This is in front. The body, the opening, and the opening varies in size. Smaller vertebrae, wider opening, because your spinal cord is thick in your neck, more so than it is as it goes farther down. So the opening, the vertebral foramen, creates a passageway or arch when you stack them. Spinous process, transverse processes, which can be very large or very small. Some of them, for instance, in the thoracic region, the ribs attach here. These little are called facets. There's one here on a transverse process and one here on the body. The area between the spinous and transverse processes is called the lamina, and it protects the spine. Years ago, when they used to do spinal surgery, they had to do a thing called the laminectomy. They cut through that. Nowadays, it's done with more mini surgical techniques. This is not easy to do. And the area between the body and the transverse processes are called pedicles. So you'll see that. And now we look at them individually. Perfect. C1 through C7 they're small, and they all have the transverse foramen and the vertebrae. Two are unique, C1 and C2. The other ones are pretty specific looking. So you're going to take you'll see this in a second. So it's a good picture to look at all of them. So again, the ones that I guess especially to describe it would be unique ones. All right, what else? That, that. Where'd you go? Yeah. All right. So the first ones are unique. They function as a unit. C1 and C2. This is C1. It's known as the atlas. And famously, Atlas held up the Earth. So it's like this. The occipital condyles sit on the condyles of the atlas. The axis, we spin on our axis. So these two structures are together like this. There's a special joint the two of them make called a pivoting joint. So it allows you to move your head side to side or pivot, as well as rock up and down, and maybe a little bit sort of tilting it one way or another. And together, they both sit like this. So they're a unit. So you have the atlas, almost round, it doesn't have a body, and you can see the projection on C2 called the dens or odontoid process. This looks like a tooth. But really, it's probably a missing body from this. And you can see they both have the openings for transverse foramina. You can see it here for that special circle. And very, very large vertebral archways so that the spinal cord is right up. That's C1 and C2. All the rest of the cervical vertebrae are fairly similar in the sense there's not much to them. This is probably C7, the largest of them. It has transverse foramina, very distinct spinous process, large opening, so it kind of looks like that. The big giveaway is here. When you begin to look at spinous, again, when we look at any of the ones in the thoracic region, you always see the spinous process going down. You always see these little tiny transverse processing on the body, so we call demi or little facets for the ribs, and then that's sort of the giveaway. And then lastly, the lumbar, big shelf. As you can see, these are where the ribs, they're called superior and inferior processes that allow the vertebrae to come together. And there's really not a lot to say. And ribs are easy. Rib. They're flat, not much to them. So I don't know which rib it is or just most ribs. Keep going. There's a picture of C1 and C2. Again, you can see that the very large superior facets. And they have mated ones on the bottom, just like the same thing underneath. Here's where that dens or tooth-like process, that knob that you can see here, where they come together. And there they are working together as a unit. And then all the rest, and the last one I showed you down here. How do I know it was the last one? Because it doesn't have that bifid or forked spinous process. And all of that comes from ligaments they're pulling on. Thoracic just gets larger as they go down. Spots for the ribs on the transverse process in the head. As you can see them there. Lumbar, only 5, very massive. Everything is thick and short. The sacrum, there's not a lot to say about the sacrum. It's pretty distinctive. Here's one from actual human skeleton, obviously broken apart over time. Here's the sacrum in the middle. So it's got an area that looks like an ear that mates to an area on both of the hip assemblies. That. So when you hear about the sacroiliac, that's the joint. The sacrum has 4 or 5 bones fused together, and there's 2 or 3 make up the coccyx. And there's really not, I mean, if this would be damaged, you could just move that. So not a lot going on. It's fused, so you still have this passageway for spinal. The nerves, the spinal cord is ended, but the nerves keep going through these little holes that come out forward this way or backward that way. So that's so the intervertebral foramina, rather than side to side, now going front and back. There's ridges on either side, but to me, it's just identifying the sacrum and spine. That's there. The same thing with the coccyx. Not much to it. So you can see there's a lot of anatomy that's in classic anatomy, a lot there. And really the ribs are everything else. The only thing that's noteworthy about what you can see on the model that I showed you initially